Ever feel like you're stuck in a rut with your jazz bass lines and solos? Well, this guy has some ways to get out of that.
After a certain point, if you play jazz gigs, you're playing 2-3 hours at a time. At a certain point, you're gonna want to mix it up.
What's going on? It's Jason Heath, and I am talking with my buddy Cole Davis. He is a rising star in the jazz bass world for sure. Won the Ron Carter competition a few years ago and has just been doing project after project. I am such a fan of his energy and talent and drive, and he just came out with a new book of scales and arpeggios, and it's a really cool way of looking at the bass and using the open strings to kind of get from region to region. So we dig into that and much more. This is available in our sheet music store. You can check that out in the description below. Hope you enjoy. When did you get this idea? How'd this idea come to pass?
So when I was at Juilliard, I studied with the great Gerald Cannon, giving credit where credit's due, and he was very critical of me because I would never use open strings for anything. I thought like an electric bass player, and that I was fearful of open strings. But in truth, the open strings are what allows us to migrate across the bass. So especially if you're playing pizzicato, if you're walking, if you're dealing with bass line, open strings are awesome. Like you can play and have blues, for example. Probably do that all day, but after about 15-20 choruses, my wrist is going to get really tired, and frankly I'm going to get a little bored if I just stay in half position. Here's the thing, with the open strings, you can play the same notes but move across the bass. Let me demonstrate. Right, so basically what I'm doing is, when I get to a chord tone when I can use the open string, like the A is the third of the F7, so that's perfect. I can do and play this C right here. Now, why am I doing it? You might think like, well, why wouldn't you just play this C right here? Right? Why wouldn't you just do that? Because after a certain point, if you play jazz gigs, you're playing 2-3 hours at a time. At a certain point, you're going to want to mix it up. At a certain point, you're going to be like, okay, I've been in half position for the last 7 minutes. Maybe it's time to move on. And if you're playing a solo, it's even more effective, because then I don't have to stay in half position. I can play the same notes and the same ideas, but I have more freedom. I can move up the neck. So instead of playing an F blues like this, that's like a good standard jazz solo on an F blues. But if I'm stuck here, that's one chorus. But if I had to do that for like 10 choruses, it would be difficult. But with the open strings, I'm allowed to migrate. Right, so I'm using the open strings there to move across the bass. I'm not just doing this, I'm using the open strings to create space and move around the instrument. So the scales and arpeggios, you practice your scales like this. D. This is F major scale.
It's like I use the phrase, it's like an escape hatch or something with the open string. Like you're down in first position, and I think that it's something that we classical players who especially like old school classical technique, maybe Samandal, we sort of just picture every string as being this like path we must go up or down. And so like thinking more laterally, sometimes people call that on the bass, it like seems to open up so many more possibilities. And yeah, it's so easy to get trapped down here, right? But like you get essentially the range here minus maybe the E string, but you have so much more possibilities right here, and the notes are closer together. It's a little softer to put the string down. You're playing for 3-4 hours or something, like having your hand here is a little bit more physically kind maybe than down here.
Exactly. I love that. The escape hatch.
It's cool. So these are like a way to sort of train someone to think like that on the bass, right?
If you get in the habit of practicing your major and minor scales that way, and I'm not here to knock the original major scale. Like obviously you got to be able to do this. Like yeah, okay, you got to be able to play your C major scale like correctly, so to speak. But if you get in the habit of practicing it this way, using this open string here, shift, and then again. So basically, I'm transitioning from half position to this middle register here, and I'm just using this one open string to do so. If I get in the habit of doing that, then all of a sudden, when I take a solo, I can basically just explore the instrument, and I don't feel locked in one position. I don't feel like, oh, I have to get all my ideas out at once in this one position right here. I'm like, I can like leave space because I know that that escape hatch is always going to be there. So I'm not as anxious. You know?
Well, it's interesting because the way that you're approaching these a little bit, not exactly, but it reminds me of kind of the way that Francois Rabath approaches scales, kind of like in what you think of as the classical world. But here's the thing, Francois is like, thinks of himself as a jazz bassist. He's like really into jazz. And so like, I was just at the Rabath Institute here in California, and the first exercise we did every day was like, and using those, like all of a sudden, kind of like using those harmonics, using the open strings to kind of like as an escape hatch or whatever, just like as a moment to like move from register to register.
I've never actually heard him improvise. I've heard him do like theme and variation, which is obviously a form of improvisation, but I've never heard him like solo. I bet like he could take a mind-blowing solo if he wanted to.
I would love to hear him put down the bow and take like a blistering bebop solo. I'll bet he has that. Yeah. I know. There's a great clip I just saw. It's on YouTube somewhere of Steve Bailey jamming with Rabath. And Steve on his 6-string electric and Rabath like playing Arco and them just playing together. And it's like super cool. It's interesting. As I was going through this and practicing this, I'm interested in how you approach it. Do you think of this as like a kind of like a giant exercise you play through from the beginning to end every day, or like how do you recommend people take this and approach it, or like just major scales one day, or just do the C one day, or like what do you do, or what seems to work in your experience?
So for me, the way I practice this is I play one scale, and then I improvise on that scale using the fingerings as a pathway to improvisation. So if I'm playing that C major scale, that's the C major scale. I'm only going to go up to there just to demonstrate it. So then I'll use this and improvise on this as a pathway. do that. And something about that just really opens up the instrument to me, because even though it's just taking a scale and improvising on it, like something we all do, looking at the fingering as a pathway is a great way to open up the instrument.
Totally, yeah. It's like you're giving yourself an artistic restriction, which is what it's so helpful for us as artists, right? Because if you just like do whatever, well then okay, but then, like, and to take something as seemingly simple as like a C major scale or something like that, and then use that as a pathway like you're describing, that's a cool way to approach it. Is that how and I'm just nerding out here, so sorry, but how long do you typically spend doing something like this in any given practice session? Is this something that you do for like an hour or just a few minutes to kind of get the brain going, or how does that work for you?
Yeah, usually like a half hour just as part of a warm-up. There's this great exercise that Gary Peacock taught. He showed it to Doug Weiss, who showed it to me. And basically you take each scale, and instead of just practicing the scale and like kind of boring yourself before you even like start musically, like start your practice session, start your day, whatever, you take the scale and you improvise on it. And you can improvise, you can do the pathway thing that I just demonstrated, or you can just like kind of whatever comes to mind, like. That trigotism, Oscar Pettiford, that just comes to mind. Like you're playing in D flat, you're like, oh, that's a song in the key of D flat. So then you start playing that. And then you do that for like a minute, and then you're like, okay, next scale, and then you play something, either an improvisation or something associated with that scale. And that really gets the mind flowing.
So I have this terrible habit. Confession time, Cole. I was like, which I think is a common classical player habit, which is I like never practice my minor scales. I'm terrible. I'm okay with my arpeggios, but I don't know what's wrong with me. I've been playing this thing for decades, but I still I never think of. I know I should. I'm just bad at that. Do you try to do like a little bit every day? Because you got the major scales, you got the minor scales in here, and then you've got the arpeggios as well. Do you try to sprinkle a little bit every day, or just kind of pick one and go with it, or?
Yeah, I kind of sprinkle a little bit every day. It also depends on like the tunes that I'm working on. If I'm working on a tune, like Thelonious Monk is a composer who basically uses dominant chords exclusively. So like if I'm like working on something like a Thelonious Monk tune, or like Coltrane, or someone who really loves dominant chords, and I'm trying to get more inside of that, I'll be like, okay, I'm going to practice the whatever, dominant 7 sharp 11 and dominant 7 sharp 9, just to really get inside the dominant chords, because that's something that I think a lot of musicians, not just jazz musicians, like any kind of musicians, really struggle to hear, because we naturally hear major and minor chords. They just kind of like occur to us. But dominant chords are really difficult to hear. So I'll go through phases where I'm working on a lot of like really dense jazz material, and that's when I really attack the dominant chords. But mostly what I do is I do major and minor scales and the major and minor arpeggios just as my warm-up, and then I'm good.
I love it. It's a cool way, and I like that. I like you call it the new major scales, the new minor scales. It's kind of like looking at it in a different way.
It's I'm definitely, I haven't gotten any direct heat for it, but I'm sure someone somewhere is like, is this dude serious? So for me, it's important for any of the jazz people listening, and obviously, I mean, I'm just talking about jazz because I mostly play jazz, but this applies to classical also, and it applies to any improvising musician. If you're playing major and minor scales and you're improvising, that's Lydian major and Dorian minor. So practice the major and minor scales, but also practice the Lydian and Dorian scales. So if I'm playing the C major scale, I'm going to do this. And I'm also going to do. And I'll improvise on both, I'll do. I'll improvise on both. Whatever, like that was C Ionian, like normal B. whatever. So for me, that's really important because I want to have the kind of vocabulary where I can make that distinction, right? Because if I'm playing a major chord in like a jazz standard, that's going to be Lydian, and I'm not going to really use the Ionian major scale. But then if I'm playing some more figured bass oriented music where maybe it's Baroque or some form of improvisation that doesn't deal with the Great American Songbook, that's all like regular major, right? Even singer-songwriter stuff, like I do a lot of non-jazz stuff in that world. And you're not playing Lydian, you're not playing sharp 11s, you're not like nerding out and showing everyone how much you know about harmony. But in jazz you are. So in jazz you want to have that option to play the Lydian and the Dorian for the minor. So that's, if I can demonstrate really quickly. So that's C minor, that's an A on a C minor. So I want to have that option too. But then if you're playing like a pop song or whatever, it's probably going to be natural minor. Right, so you want to have that vocabulary, and that's kind of the thing that I really try to emphasize when I do these books. It's like, you want to have the vocabulary to make certain choices based on the situation you're in, rather than just being like, oh, C major scale, that's this. Oh, they said C major, I'm going to play this. It's like, no, you want to have a vocabulary of places you can take everything.
Well, this is a great way to develop the vocabulary too, to have it like that. And it's great to see how you approach it too. And then using these open strings to navigate the bass, it's an elegant way. It's a great way to get out of the seductive trap of being down here. And I love it. It's really cool. Good stuff. If you dug today's video, check out what we've got linked up, and we'll see you in the next one. This guy needs to say hi to you. So this is William.